Okay, I think we're ready to start. So thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. It's Julia here from Inspira Advantage. We're an admissions consulting company dedicated to helping deserving students get into the professional school of their dreams. We have an awesome webinar scheduled for you today. So we'll be going through what we're going to be talking about, and then I'll introduce our lovely panelists as well. If you don't mind changing.
Had a little bit of a delay, but I got it.
Yeah. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, so Clara is helping out with the slide. So thank you, Clara. For starters, we're going to start introduction. So I'll introduce Clara to you guys, and we'll talk about a little bit about her expertise. Then we'll talk about insight into vet school interviews and what you can expect for that. And then dive into how to prepare for school interviews and what to expect on your interview day so you're best prepared. And then common vet school questions and how to answer them we will be addressing as well. And then we will have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, we ask that you hold on to them. And when we get to the Q&A portion, you can type them into the little chat box and Clara would be happy to answer them for you. So let's go ahead and introduce Clara to you. Clara, if you want to go ahead, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, everyone. Like she said, my name is Clara. I am a freshly graduated veterinarian, and I did my both veterinary degree and bachelor's at Iowa State University. I also have a master's in public health from the University of Iowa, and am currently a PhD candidate at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD. So I am what you would call an atypical veterinary student and professional, but I went through what you're going through now. I know how stressful it can be, and I'm really looking forward to making this process easy for you and answering your questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So let's get started with insight into vet school interviews. What can we really expect here?
Awesome. So we're going to first discuss the types of interviews that you might encounter during your interview process, the first of which is going to be a panel interview. So you'll have more than one person asking you questions. Some schools are going to mix up who you're talking to. So maybe you're meeting with a veterinarian that's associated with the school. Maybe you're interviewing with a lecturer, a PhD, or potentially also staff. So this interview is going to be question-based, and your interview should be kind of like a conversation, a back and forth. Someone will ask you a question, and then you'll answer accordingly. This type of an interview can also be open or closed file. So what that means is in an open file interview, your interviewers can see your application, and they can actually know, what you've replied to the questions, see your personal statement, etc. Versus a closed file interview where they know nothing about you and are just going to be rating you, deciding how you perform based off of that interview alone. The next type of an interview is a one-on-one. It's pretty much self-explanatory. Instead of a panel, you're meeting with someone one-on-one who's going to be asking you questions. So again, you're going to encounter a mix of people who are going to interview you, whether they're vets, instructors, or staff. This one is also going to be question-based, and it could be open or closed file. What everyone is probably here to discuss tonight is the MMI interview. So MMI stands for multiple mini interviews, and this format can vary by school, but typically it involves a series of short, independent interviews with different assessors and also different stations. So every station may present a scenario, a question, a task for you, the interviewee, to address. And this format is often used to assess your problem-solving skills, also your communication, and just like generally your interpersonal ability. Many students find this interview to be the most intimidating interview just because you don't know what you're going to expect. So the role of interviews in the admissions process These interviews are typically pivotal for like the holistic evaluation of your application, assessing not only your academic qualifications, maybe your GPA isn't as stellar as you'd want it to be, but here's where you can really shine in your interpersonal skills, what makes you unique, and also just your genuine passion for veterinary medicine on a whole.
Awesome. So now that we know a little bit about interviews, how can we best prepare for them?
Great question. So I think it's best to prepare yourself by doing your research, understanding the interview format. So we've already reviewed some of that tonight. And then also when you go into your interview, above all else, you want to let your interviewer know how enthusiastic and excited you are. That energy really comes across. And when I can say that when I've interviewed students, it is probably the thing that stands out the most and leaves the most durable impression. To do this, you can hone your soft skills, communication, eye contact is probably the hardest one for me. And then you can also prepare for some of the questions that you'll encounter. I do this by doing quick Google searches sometimes. What types of ethical questions should I be thinking of ahead of time? What situations might I encounter in the veterinary clinic that they will be asking me about for a situational interview? It's very important to stay calm and confident. Even if you have some nerves, just remember that you are there to only tell them about you and who you are. And you can be very confident in the fact that you're the one that knows you best. As far as dress and punctuality are concerned, obviously be on time. I would say be early. That can both help you with your confidence and also show them that you're well prepared. As far as dress, I can answer more specific questions about dress in the chat, and it also depends on if you're joining via Zoom or in person. I think we all know that dressing up for Zoom is a little bit different than in person, but I'm happy to answer questions that you have about that. I would typically suggest professional dress. Something that you might not be thinking about is questions that you need to ask your interviewers, because remember that while this is an interview for you getting into vet school, it's also an interview of your own to decide, is this vet school the right one for me? So asking about issues that you are most passionate about. Potentially you are really concerned about being at a school that promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion. That could be a question that you ask your interviewer to see what their current strategies are for addressing that and how inclusive the college is as a whole. And then your post-interview follow-up. So typically I recommend doing this as soon as possible, but probably within 24 to 48 hours, sending out an email or a note to your interviewers to say thank you for the interview time, and then to also just follow up on your interview, reflect on it, and show them that you remain interested after your interview.
Awesome. So what can we expect on our interview day? Walk us through.
So interview day will look like a structure. You might get a schedule with either your one-on-one interview, your panel, your MMI stations, depending on what their certain structure is. So this might include problem solving, ethical judgment, and then after the interviews, this is kind of hit or miss. It's not always the case, but you might have an opportunity for feedback or reflection. If you do, I always say that's a green flag. If someone wants to know how your experience went, then that definitely says something to how they care about their students. So expect a thorough evaluation of your qualifications, interpersonal skills, ethics, and commitment to vet med. However, you can't necessarily expect that you'll get that same day, but you'll definitely be evaluated on those different characteristics.
All right, the most important part, I think. Common vet school questions and how to answer them so you're best prepared for your interview.
These are some of the hardest yet easiest questions. I think it's a great one to start with. Why do you want to be a vet? This question should probably be the one that you are the most confident in, as this is the entire point of why you're applying to vet school. And I always recommend to try your hardest. It can be really easy to say that you've loved animals from a young age and that you yet you do want to improve their well-being. These are things that you definitely should include, but I would recommend not to be cliche, and talk about your other loves that have brought you to veterinary medicine. Potentially you love research, you are very fascinated by medicine, you like the puzzle and the problem solving, or you just really enjoy the community. Sharing personal anecdotes, as the screen says, is a great way of adding a personal note to your interview and really connecting with your interviewers. Potentially you had a pet of your own and went through a situation at the vet that got you interested in medicine. Definitely highlight that in this question. So what would you do if a client couldn't afford recommended treatment for their pet? Another very good question, and also one that is trying to get at your problem solving skills as well as your overall outlook about this commonly encountered issue in veterinary medicine. So importantly, you should discuss your ethical stance, emphasize your commitment to alternative options. If you're not familiar, there are multiple options for clients to pay for pet care that aren't necessarily putting it on the credit card. Definitely familiarize yourself with a couple of those because this question will probably come up. You can also discuss offering compassionate care and then considering the animal's welfare. I would say above all, animal welfare should be at the top of your answer to this question because your job as a veterinarian is to make sure that you do no harm. You want to make sure that the animal's welfare is always considered, even if it's more of a challenge for the client. A tricky question. What do you see as the most significant ethical issue in veterinary medicine today? I can say that schools are starting to ramp up this question. They're really liking taking ethical stances and putting you in that position where you are making an ethical stance because it's a hot topic right now. You know, animal welfare is never going to disappear. It's going to constantly be something that people are talking about. So whether it's factory farming, the use of antibiotics in animals, you can discuss your thoughts on how this should be addressed. One question that I actually got myself recently was to describe the difference between animal rights and animal welfare. It's a very challenging question to answer, and it's also very philosophical. So my recommendation for your ethical questions would be to research some of the current ethical issues that are going on in the profession and look at current stances and try to align yourself with one and be able to speak to kind of the philosophical underlying as to why you feel that way about that issue. What experience do you have working with animals? You might feel like this is a question that, you know, opens up a can of worms, that you have a lot to say because you've been working with animals for years. It's also a question where you can shine. So if you have any unique experiences, you've worked with exotic animals or potentially horses or cattle, maybe less typical species, definitely highlight that. But otherwise, I would highlight volunteering, interning, anything that you've been able to do that's hands-on. And very importantly, discuss any challenges that you've encountered and how you've overcome them. I assume that anyone that's ever worked with an animal has encountered a challenge. Animals are not always easy. So definitely highlighting why and how you were able to overcome challenge is a very strong aspect of your interview. What's your favorite animal and why? Might be kind of more of a silly question, but potentially they're trying to get a kind of like a deeper understanding of who you are, what drives you, and what your interests are. So you can share your preference and explain it, discuss whether it's due to your experience with the animal or lack thereof. And then you can explain how this animal potentially inspired your passion for veterinary medicine and shaped your commitment to the field. When I ask this question, I either will choose something more random or, like this example says, I would choose one where I've had a specific situation. Like maybe I've worked with a specific dog that case was really challenging, but motivated me to continue on. I would kind of go one of two ways on this one. So some more vet school questions that you'll certainly encounter. Have you ever had a conflict with a colleague? How did you handle that situation? Would certainly recommend having one of these scenarios in your head ready to go, ready to share. These questions always come up, especially in those multiple mini interviews. What's your best subject in school? This one's easy. You can be as honest as you want. Are you a mathematician? Are you really interested in chemistry? Or did you excel in some of your nutrition classes? These are ways to highlight your unique skill set and really stand out from the crowd. And just keep in mind that not everyone who applies to vet school had a pre-veterinary degree. Some people, I have a friend who graduated recently who did his major in economics, and that makes you unique and different. So don't be afraid to kind of let that shine during your interview. Do you have any ethical concerns with zoos? Again, this comes back to the ethical questions that I would recommend researching ahead of time. Definitely, I would steer clear of taking too extreme a stance on any ethical question. It's always good to remain somewhat neutral. Like siding with one side, but not all the way to that side, just to kind of show your interviewers that you are open to discussing this further. You aren't completely closed-minded to the idea of changing your mind, because some people do. What do you think of animals being used as entertainment, circus, film, television? Again, it goes right in with the zoo question where you're thinking about animals and their welfare and their rights. And I would honestly take this wherever you feel. Don't try to hide your own personal opinion, but just have a really nice explanation for why you feel that way, and how maybe you feel that animals are either being treated well or not well, just to give an example to follow up. Do you eat meat? Why or why not? This question, while it's also challenging and it's ethical, but it kind of gets to a more, I guess, like granular detail of if you believe that animals should be eaten or not, and can be used as a screening technique. So I would definitely recommend, if you don't eat meat, I'm one of those people, I don't eat meat, and I have gotten this question before, and I definitely will be honest and share that I don't eat meat, but I wouldn't share necessarily that it's because of any animal rights or animal welfare concerns, and that I keep an open mind. So just making sure that you don't box yourself into a corner saying that, oh, I don't eat meat and it's because I'm an animal rights activist, because that could kind of pigeonhole you into that philosophical way of thinking, rather making you a more moderate candidate. And if you could own any pet in the world, what would you own and why? This one's fun. You get to just decide something that you'd be interested in, so kind of have an idea of what in your head you would answer to a question like this. It might be used as an icebreaker in the beginning of your interviews. And then, do you have any phobias of any animals? I've never personally had this question, and I find it very interesting, but definitely be honest. But I would say that most of us in the veterinary field probably don't have any phobias of animals other than maybe, I guess personally, spiders, which I don't know if I would consider them animals or arachnids. So this is a part of our session tonight where we get to jump into questions. I'm more than happy to answer questions about anything that's on your mind. It doesn't have to be about necessarily what we chatted about today. The chat function's open, and as soon as I see a question, I will start answering. Thank you guys so much.
There's one that I actually had about questions. It looks like they're really kind of animal focused. Do you get, or in your experience, have there been questions asked where it's more like academic focused in nature? Like maybe you're being asked about, your passion for science or medicine or what have you?
Absolutely, especially during those kind of like open application interviews. So I've had interviews where they have my application sitting in front of them and they're highlighting it as I'm kind of walking through my background. And interviewers won't be shy. If they have questions about how you did on your organic chemistry 2 final, then they'll ask. So just be prepared to have validation. If you have any grades that you're not essentially proud of, to be ready to kind of validate those. I was going through a tough time. I was learning how to study appropriately. I was learning how best to study, to take tests. Maybe you had test anxiety and you needed to have accommodations put in place. Be honest, but also have a good validation for maybe why you didn't perform at the top standard. But definitely, academic questions will be asked constantly. I think they weren't covered here in detail just because it's a little more general, but definitely be prepared to talk about your own academic adventures, maybe if you took time off, etc.
Got it.
I see a question in the chat: with so few vet schools around, how can they be so different as to finding a good fit? Other than the obvious location differences, how different are some vet schools than others? Wonderful question. It does seem funny, there's a limited amount of vet schools. They all have to have a core curriculum. How different can they be? I think location, like you mentioned, is a huge difference. I personally went to school in Iowa, and if I were to choose a vet school again, I'm not sure I would have chosen that location. The winters get pretty cold. But aside from location differences, I would say the biggest thing that vet schools differ in is their expertise. So some vet schools, like the one that I went to, are very heavily agriculturally focused. So production animals were something that we had a lot of specialists in. We had a lot of curriculum based around production animals such as cows, pigs, and even horses as well, poultry. So that was one specific difference, that if I went to a school in maybe a more urban area, I wouldn't have had access to some really great professors in that area. Otherwise, there are going to be things like, I guess, your clinic size. Some vet schools don't have a clinic that's attached. So when you go through your clinical rotations, you have to leave campus and go elsewhere. That could be a pro if you don't want to stay in one area for too long. It could be a con if you don't want to travel the US during your clinical year and you want to save some money. So there are some differences between the vet schools practically. And then also I would say there's definitely, just like there's different kind of vibes between schools on a more general level, there's definitely different vibes within vet schools. What types of professors they're hiring? Are they young? Are they old? What types of people they're admitting? Are they on the younger side? Are they more progressive? It's really good to get to know the professors and the students at the school that you're interviewing at to get a better sense of if you will fit their molds. So great question. And I see another one. When reaching out to interviewers for a follow-up, what are your thoughts on a handwritten thank you note? Are they acceptable and professional? Personally, I think that handwritten thank you notes are an exceptional way to thank anyone. Think about how much time it takes you to go buy a stationery, take a pen, write your thoughts down, put it in an envelope, and then personally hand it to someone. I think that generally, especially in the older generations, that means so much more to them than a typical email. That's not to say that if you write your interviewer an email that you're going to be discarded from the interview pile. That's absolutely not the case. They get it, you're busy, and maybe you're not in person. So I would say that handwritten thank you notes are never going to ding you, but an email is also just fine if you don't want to go through the hassle. Good questions, guys. Do you have any more? Or did I miss any part of your question that you want to have answered more clearly?
Yeah, we'll wait a little bit longer, but in your experience, do you think maybe you could talk about, when obviously, you're going to be asked questions during a vet school interview, but are there any ideal questions that you can ask as the interviewee to help navigate, see if vet school is the best choice for you?
Yeah, I think something that comes to mind if we're talking about fit, so kind of extrapolating off of that question, if you want to know how to kind of fit into a vet school, you can ask questions that are targeted towards what you're looking for. Potentially, you want a school that's not super focused on your academic performance, but wants you to succeed clinically. You could ask, how much of our coursework is going to be clinically focused? How many hands-on clinical hours will I be able to receive in the first 3 years? Typically, vet school is going to be more didactic or lecture-based for 3 years, and then you jump into a clinical year at the 4th year, but that's not always the case. Some schools have labs, they have surgery courses. How often do I get to be hands-on? How confident are your graduates once they leave the program? How many of them are employed? Some of these guided questions that can give you a better idea about how vet schools measure success and how they will promote yours, I think are really great questions to ask to get an idea both about fit and about, would this vet school promote my success? Do they care about me as a student? All right, we've got one more question, or a couple more questions. Okay, so do you know ahead of time the type of interview you'll have? Unfortunately, not all the time. Usually, I would say if you're going to have an MMI, you will get a note ahead of time that that's the interview structure, just because it's kind of atypical, and they want you to have some time to prepare. But otherwise, I wouldn't count on knowing what type of interview you're going to have ahead of time. But know that the same skills, the same questions are generally going to be asked across the board. So whether you're going station to station to be answering questions, or you're sitting in front of a panel, you are going to be able to prepare for those in generally about the same way. So great question, but unfortunately, it's hit or miss. I can't really speak to that. I wish you could know ahead of time, because the MMIs sometimes come with a little more anxiety. Brittany also asked, how do you answer a question that you don't exactly know the answer to? I start with honesty. So if I was asked a question in an interview over a topic that I was not familiar with, I would say, to be honest, I'm not the most familiar with what your question poses, but here is my response to what I did take away from your question. So if it's maybe over a specific ethical issue that you've never heard of, you can say, I'm not very familiar with that, but here's my take on this one. Basically a redirection. So an acknowledgement and a redirection is what I would recommend for those questions. Although I will say that generally you don't need to be too worried about those questions. Interviews are really a time that you get to just talk about your life, what you've done. You should have most of the answers to the questions that you're going to get as far as content is concerned. And yeah, just being honest. You don't want to come across as someone who's going to lie. I think integrity is really essential in the veterinary profession, and that's a pretty widely held belief. So being honest and open and being willing to learn is a great way to start off your interview if you don't know the answer. Riley asks, is it silly to ask questions that they already answered on the vet school website? Definitely not, especially if you get to the end of the interview, you're exhausted, you can't think straight, and now it's your turn to ask questions, and you're thinking, oh God, what should I be asking? I forgot my predetermined questions, but I remember on their website they said this. Definitely ask it, but maybe go into a little bit of greater detail. So you could ask them simply, could you expand on what you have listed on your website? So say that they are touting maybe like their curriculum. You could say, oh, I saw on the website that your curriculum is special because of this reason. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Open-ended questions are great, gets your interviewers talking, less questions for you. And it also gives you more information, so it's a win-win. Definitely not silly.
Alrighty, I think that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you so much, you guys, for the insightful questions. And thank you so much, Clara, for your answers. It was really awesome to even listen in as somebody that's not going to vet school, but it was super interesting anyways. I do want to flag that this presentation will be sent out tomorrow. So if you've missed anything or if you want to review, you'll have that opportunity and we'll be sending it to you tomorrow in a little video presentation doc. But once again, thank you everybody so much for joining, and thank you, Clara, for answering your questions. Have a great night, everybody.
Have a good night. Thank you, guys.
Bye.